I'm here with Wayne Fischer at the Ontario Steam Heritage Museum. Tell us what you got here, Wayne.
Well, this is our stationary barn with stationary engines, and what we have here is a steam engine that came out of Krug Brothers Furniture. Was manufactured in 1905, and could power a factory if you weren't on a river and you could have a water turbine. There was no electrical grid yet, so every factory had to generate their own power. So for mechanical power, you put a leather belt around this big flywheel, and it went up onto the ceiling and drove line shafting. And above the line, below the line shafting, you put all your machines driven with flat leather belts. So then this engine was designed in the 1870s, but by the time you got to the 1890s, there was this new modern invention called electric lighting, which everyone wanted to have. So what they did was they moved the outboard bearing out, and they put a wooden pulley on it, which drove an alternator. So now, guess what? The factories could go from single shift to 3-shift operation because you had light around the clock. So that was a significant advancement. So this was for a modern furniture factory in 1905. Now we move down here. This was for a modern furniture factory in 1925. So so 20 years later, instead of running a leather belt up onto the ceiling, they're running an 60-cycle electric generator, because during that period between 1905 and 1925 was the First World War, and during the First World War, the cost of electric motors dropped. So by the time you got to the end of the war, you could now buy an engine lathe, a drilling machine, a milling machine with an electric motor. You now had an electrical grid in most of the big cities. So from then on, any factories built after the First World War, you used electrical power and electric motors to transmit your power. You didn't use leather belts. So that was a significant shift, remembering the fact that you used leather belts from 1920, say, going all the way back to the 1700s. They used leather belts off-road. So that was a big change in power transmission. What we've got down here is one of the last big coreless cross-pound steam engines left in Canada. And this was donated to us by the Canadian Science and Technology Museum in Ottawa. And I used to go up to Ottawa prior to the pandemic and help them sort out their steam things. Anyways, this engine weighs 86,000 pounds, and it's came down on 3 float trucks in 9 pieces. We poured 35 cubic meters of concrete to support it. We spent 4 months repairing the missing pieces, like the valve linkages and all that. The high pressure cylinder is 19 inches in diameter. The low pressure cylinder, 34 inches in diameter. So big in diameter, in order to keep the piston square in the cylinder, you have to put a tail rod on it, riding on a slipper out here to keep the piston square inside. And the purpose of this machine was to run this 220 volt, 1600 amp DC generator to supply direct current. And this was purchased in 1908, and of course there's no electrical grid back in those days, by the Grand Trunk Railway for their Stratford shops, where they rebuilt all the locomotives. And if you look over here, there's a picture on the wall up there. That is the last locomotive overhauled at the Stratford shops. The next day, that picture was taken November 1963. The next day, they announced the closing of that facility because now they had converted all their locomotives from steam to diesel electric. So, and then they closed that shop. But this is the machine that supplied the DC to run the overhead cranes wherever you needed variable speed.
So, can you fire this thing?
If I had it's all set. We've even set the valves on it. The only thing left to do is to anchor it down with epoxy anchors into the concrete, and of course to find a boiler big enough to run it, because this is 550 horsepower, and I figured I'd need at least a 100 horsepower boiler to run it, because you can imagine a 34-inch diameter cylinder. You're putting steam in both ends. You're doing 300 strokes a minute. You can imagine how much steam that's going to take just to bring it up to speed.
Yeah.
So with that, I'm trying to give our visitors the feeling of what it was like to go into a powerhouse in 1900. So we built a switchboard. The first 5 sections of this switchboard came out of Timothy Eaton's department store. Now, when Timothy Eaton built his first department store in where the Eaton Center is today, he had a powerhouse. He had a switchboard over 100 feet long, and he had steam engines running AC generators for the lighting. He had steam engines running DC generators for the elevators, because they had to be variable speed. So the first 4 sections of the board are AC, the last 2 sections are DC. And you'll see the size of the meters on here. And these meters are this big because, and the patent dates, by the way, and most of this stuff is like the late 1880s and 1890s. And the reason the meters were so big was that they had not developed automatic voltage regulating circuits. So the engineer running the powerhouse, as the load would build up, he'd have to go over to the AC generator, adjust the field rheostat. So he had to be able to see these meters 25 feet away, and of course it was dingy lighting in there, right? So if you have a look up there, there's a target, and there's also a hole in the needle. Now you notice the light bulbs that are in there so that they could see it from 25 feet away. But have a look on an angle at the light bulb that's in there. What you're seeing is an 1892 Edison reproduction light bulb, complete with a carbon filament. And you see how yellow it is? So he rated his light bulbs in candle power. So that's a 16 candle power bulb. And because people back in 1880s and 1890s, they didn't know what a watt was or a volt or an amp. But they knew what a candle was because they were lighting their houses with candles. So they're 16 candle power. And 16 candle power. And the reason why he had a switchboard 100 feet long was he monitored the power to every department. And he also owned 20 buildings around where the Eaton Center is, which were factories, and he sent the power out to these factories. So he was running his own electrical grid before there was an electrical grid. And in the factories, he'd made everything from horse harnesses to underwear, which he'd sell in his various stores. So that's why, and he had thermal recording meters. So like the one here is the amount of power consumed by the beauty salon, and the other one is in the passenger elevator department, and this is on the Hatter Street buildings that were consuming power. So he knew what his costs were.
Unbelievable.
So now you've seen an Edison bulb. Although it's a reproduction.
See that locomotive that's in midair in that photograph?
Yeah, it's being held by that crane. That crane could lift 200 tons. And so this engine was installed in 1908. And this is what provided the DC to run that overhead crane. This is a Westinghouse Parsons steam turbine that they gave us at the museum up there in Ottawa. And this is another Wheelock engine. Like that's a 150 horsepower Wheelock engine when we came through the door. This is 75 horsepower. We put a traction engine outside, run the steam lines out to it, and we can run this thing. And When we first fired it up, we got all the instruction manuals that came with it from Babcock Wilcox, and we brought it up to speed. I put a tachometer on it, and it was 100 RPM, right on the money. And in other words, the fly ball governors, the regulator, everything was working perfect. The only thing we had to do was pour new shoes for the crosshead. But my wife likes this engine because you can see what's happening, eh? There's not like a computer with all this black box magic stuff, eh?
There's nothing hidden.
No. So, for instance, everything works on basic principles. You want to lubricate this pin here. So you got an oiler on here, and there's a plug in here, and the water goes, or the oil drips down through here, and then centrifugal force takes it and drives the oil all the way down to lubricate this pin. Likewise, on the other end, you've got to lubricate the pin on the crosshead. So you've got another one of these regulators or oilers up here, and you set the needle valve up here, so you got a nice little drip in there, only it comes down onto a piece of kerosene lamp wick. And then on here, you put a little liquor. Every time the crosshead comes up, it takes a little lick, and then the oil goes down and lubricates that pin. Now, if you get this needle valve set so that too much oil flow, they even provided a spittoon to collect the oil so you didn't get your floor dirty.
You've got a miniature
this is
steam engine, I guess.
the little miniature, a little garden variety locomotive, and this is owned by one of our volunteers, a young fellow about 19 years old, and he comes out here and volunteers. So he bought this little locomotive, and his parents have a couple of thousand feet of track on their property, and the boiler was shot on this one, so we bought him a new piece of Schedule 80 pipe to put to make a new boiler barrel, and he's done a complete overhaul of this thing, so he's in the process of putting her back together again, and this spring he'll be running it out on his property, but he comes out here and helps with some of the other projects out here as well. It's sort of like a disease when you get into steam, and the only solution for it is you buy more steam traction engines or you buy locomotives. I think this is the third one he owns now. So
He's 19 years old and he's got 3.
yeah.
Oh, he's in trouble.
Yeah, as I said, it's like a disease, and that's the only cure is to buy more.
This is quite a machine. So
Yeah,
what
he's
will
got
he?
a car that goes behind it.
What will he fire it on?
He fires it with coal, because here's the door in here, so you can't really put a lot of wood in there, right? So he uses real fine coal, and we can show you some coal up there that he uses. Yeah.
Well, that's interesting.
Okay, so